Thank you very much, and thank you to Roy and Paul for the invitation, and thank you all very much for coming. Can you hear me at the back okay? Excellent, good. If at any point I drop my voice, just wave at me. So switching to the Roman period now, I think we've been very nicely set up by Paul and Tom in terms of some of the themes that we can pull on in relation to Nero and his Olympic adventures. I'm not sure what de Coubertin would have made of Nero, but I'm sure he didn't quite live up to the manly ideals that Paul was describing and Tom was describing as well. But maybe we can look at this also in a sort of broader political view of why Nero's attitudes towards the Olympics, and I must confess not just the Olympics, all of the 4 Pan-Hellenic Games, and why they matter to our historians so much. So I want to start off just with a very brief introduction. Sorry about the meme. Actually, I've realised that the meme is slightly wrong. He was in the Olympic Games in '66, not '67, but there we go. So Nero, as you may well know, was not an emperor well known for making good decisions. He is someone who has quite a rocky history in terms of not only his characterisation by our ancient sources, but also in terms of his reception. As Paul was talking about, reception is always important when we're trying to deconstruct our notions of the past. But also he's known as an emperor who went over to Greece to take part in games during his time as princeps, as emperor. He left Rome in the charge of one of his freedmen named Helius, and he went over in 66 and 67, so roughly sort of autumn 66 to autumn 67, to take part in the major sporting events in Greece, the Pythian, Isthmian, Nemean and Olympic Games. And we have a few sources that tell us about what Nero did while he was there. I should also say this is towards the end of Nero's reign. He doesn't last for very much longer after this. 68 is the year that there's a transfer of the dynasty to the next emperor. So where we're very much at the sort of tail end and the worst end of Nero's characterization in terms of our history sources. But we have 2 main literary sources for this. Oh, there we go. Suetonius, who's a biographer, he's writing in Latin, and he gives us an account of the emperors, again, as you probably know, plus Julius Caesar, up until the reign of Domitian, so the 12 Caesars, as it's called. And he's writing roughly under the reign of Hadrian, who of course is another emperor known for his interest in Greece and in the wider empire. Oh, there we go. And we also have Cassius Dio, and Cassius Dio is writing in Greek. He's from Bithynia in Asia Minor, and he's writing a history of Rome in the late 2nd to early 3rd century CE, so quite a number of years, generations after Nero's reign. He's writing in the Severan period, and both of these sources actually talk a lot about Nero in Greece and Nero's relationship with sport and the games. It is a big feature of both of their stories, but particularly Cassius Dio. He does dwell on this, Nero's adventures or perhaps more sinister adventures in Greece in quite a lot of detail. We don't unfortunately have Tacitus on this because this comes in the part of Nero's reign after we've lost those books of Tacitus. I'm sure he would have written about it in book 16, but unfortunately we've lost the majority of that book. So we are relying on Suetonius and Cassius Dio. There are a few other mentions to Nero in Greece in other sources. Pausanias, who we've just heard about, mentions sort of Nero's relationship with Greece, as does Plutarch in fairly limited terms. But in terms of sort of narrative historiography and biography, Suetonius and Cassius Dio are where we're mainly located. So I'll take you through now. Apologies for the text-heavy slide, but well, text-heavy 4 slides, but they're worth going through in a little bit of detail to give you a sense of exactly how our historians are talking about Nero and his trip to Greece. So this first from Suetonius, and interestingly this Suetonius's life of Nero and his life of emperors are not chronologically structured. He doesn't go from birth to death as someone like Plutarch does. He starts with a bit of family history, and death sort of comes normally towards the end-ish of the biographies, but then he goes on to talk about personal characteristics and other things. And this section of the Nero's biography comes after what's known as the divisio. So it's the bit of his biography where he goes from the good or the better things that Nero does to the bad things Nero does. And he's just started off on his list of bad things, and he starts that list with Nero's involvement in sport. So he talks about Nero's principal motive for going to Greece as being the following. So those city-states whose custom it was to organise musical competitions decided to award all of the prizes to for lyre playing to him. He received these with such pleasure that the messengers who brought them were not only given precedence but were made most welcome at his private supper parties. So this is the beginning of a story where Nero is able to get prizes in competitions for artistic events in particular, not even being there. He doesn't have to be there, he's sent the prizes. When some of them requested that he sing after, he accepted with alacrity and declared that only the Greeks knew how to listen and that only they were worthy of him and his talents. He did not delay his departure at this point, and as soon as he had crossed to Cassiope, he at once embarked on singing at the altar of Jupiter Cassius, and then went off on his tour of all the competitions. For he had given order, this is a really good bit, that the competitions normally held at quite different times should be made to take place in the space of 1 year, causing some of them to be repeated, in fact. And he instructed against all precedent that a musical competition was to be added to the Olympic Games. You could scarcely believe how, I'll come to that next bit actually in a minute, but the idea that he's not only playing around with the dates of these events, and in terms of the Olympics, it's put back by a year and has to happen in autumn instead of the summer. So Paul's sort of, really brilliant overview of how the ancient Olympic Games are not disrupted except by Nero, and they still happen. So he's not cancelling them, but he does delay them by a year and push them to a slightly different season. That is one of the sort of major things that he does in this reorganisation. Some games have to happen twice in a very short space of time because of Nero's desire to take part in all of these events and festivals. And he's playing around with those competitions as well, adding a musical competition. As Paul said, normally this isn't a feature of the Olympics. Then Suetonius goes on to talk about how serious Nero is about competing in these games and how seriously he takes them, despite the fact he's, emperor and getting all sorts of prizes without even competing previously. So you could scarcely believe how nervous and anxious he was in competitions, or how he competed against his rivals, or how he feared the judges' verdicts. He would pay attention to the competitors and seek their favour, as if they were his equals. And I'll come back to that. There's a problem here of an emperor sort of trying to treat everybody as if they are his equals. However, that doesn't last long. Then he cast aspersions on them behind their backs. Some he would insult to their faces. He would even bribe those who were especially talented. Nevertheless, he would address the judges most reverently before he began, assuring them that he had done all that he could, but the outcome would be determined by fate. They, as wise and learned men, were to ignore what was torturous. And when they encouraged him to take heart, he would withdraw somewhat calmer, but not altogether without concern, interpreting the silence and, sorry, I can't quite read that bit, interpreting the silence and restraint of some as moroseness and ill nature, and saying he could not trust them. During his competition performance, he followed the rules most strictly, never daring to cough or wiping sweat from his brow with his arm. And once when he was performing a tragedy and he dropped his scepter and picked it up again, he was fearful and anxious that he might be disqualified for this fault, and could only be reassured by the accompanist's assurance that no one had noticed it amid the rapturous cheers of the audience. And this refers now to the meme. However, it was he himself who proclaimed his own victory, for he was also an entrant in the competition for public heralds. And so no memory or trace should remain anywhere of any other victor in the sacred games. He gave orders that all of their statues and images should be overturned and dragged by a hook to the lavatories where they would be disposed of. So several different things going on in this account, some of them, playing up the idea of Nero as performative emperor and the anxiousness he had about that. But perhaps we, take a bit more seriously that idea that he is tearing down statues of those who had won in competitions before. Edward Champlin, who wrote a brilliant book on Nero in 2003, does kind of figure this as an exaggeration, but even as an exaggeration, it's still an interesting kind of comment on Nero and the seriousness, actually, of what he was doing in Greece at the time. So that's Suetonius's main take on this. He then goes off after this to talk about Nero's return in Rome and how he had a sort of triumph, a mock triumph almost, in the style of Augustus, but of course he's coming back from victories that are not military, but are artistic. Moving on, though, now to Cassius Dio. And Cassius Dio is incredibly interesting on Nero in Greece because he sort of paints Nero as the ultimate sort of, unlike what we've had before, but almost anti-Hellenic rather than Phil-Hellenic. He starts with Nero's trip to Greece and the performances that he's in, but he goes on after the bits that I'm going to give you to talk about how he slaughtered families and used it as basically his own killing. He brought people over from Rome to Greece who he wanted to assassinate, and used Greece as a sort of killing ground for his own imperial ideas. And his Praetorian prefect Tigellinus was very important in this as well. And another interesting thing that Cassius Dio does then, he describes Nero as waging war on Greece, and he uses these military metaphors throughout his characterization, including in relation to the sports, which again draws on I think, Paul's point about this, the sort of Orwellian aspect of this, war without the guns, though this is sort of a bit with guns as well. So in this account, Nero crossed over into Greece not as Flamininus or Mummius or as Agrippa or Augustus, so famous military interventions in Greece. His ancestors had done, but for the purpose of driving chariots, playing the lyre, making proclamations and acting in tragedies. Rome, it seems, was not enough for him, nor Pompey's theatre, nor the greatest circus, but he desired also a foreign campaign in order to become, as he said, victor of the Grand Tour. And a multitude, not only of the Augustans, these are sort of his followers that applaud him, but also of other persons as well were taken with him, large enough, if they had been a hostile host, to have subdued both Parthians and all other nations. Had this been a military excavation, he had enough followers to defeat the Parthians. That's also a loaded reference because he's just come off a diplomatic engagement with the Parthians, but perhaps more on that later. But they were the kind you would have expected Nero's soldiers to be, and the arms they carried were lyres and plectra, masks and buskins. The victories Nero won were such as befitted that sort of army, and he overcame Terpnus and Diodorus and Parmenes instead of Philip or Perseus or Antiochus. So famous actors and pantomimes rather than these famous kings and generals. Yet how could one endure even to hear about, let alone behold, a senator, a patrician, a high priest, a Caesar, an emperor, an Augustus, named on the program among contestants, training his voice, practicing various songs, wearing long hair on his head, the while his chin was smooth shaven, throwing his toga over his shoulder in the races, walking about with one or two attendants, looking askance at his opponents and constantly uttering taunting remarks to them, standing in the dread of the directors of the games and the wielders of the whip, and lavishing money on all secretly to avoid being brought to book and scourged. So again, bribing and tormenting the people he's competing against and judges. And all this he did, though, by winning the contests of the lyre players and tragedians and heralds, he would make certain his defeat in the contest of the Caesars. So the political aspect coming in here as well. He continues, what harsher prescription could there be ever than this, in which it was not Sulla that posted the names of others, this is prescriptions, but Nero that posted his own name? What stranger victory than the one which he received the crown of wild olive, bay, parsley, or pine, and lost the political crown? Yet why should one lament these acts of his alone, seeing that he was also elevated himself on high-souled buskins only to fall from the throne, and in putting on the mask threw off the dignity of his sovereignty to beg in the guise of a runaway slave, or to be led about as a blind man, or to be heavy with child, to be in labour, to be a madman, to wander or to wander an outcast, his favourite roles being those of Oedipus, Thyestes, Heracles, Alcmaeon, and Orestes. The masks that he wore were sometimes made to resemble the characters he was portraying, and sometimes he bore his own likeness. But the women's masks were all fashioned after the features of Sabina, Poppaea Sabina, his wife, who had recently died, in order that, though dead, she might still take part in the spectacle. All the situations that ordinary actors simulate in their acting, he too would portray in his speech or action, or in submitting to the action of others, save only that golden chains were used to bind him, for apparently it was not thought proper for a Roman emperor to be bound in iron shackles. So other than the gold chains, he's very equitable with the other performers. All this behaviour, nevertheless, was witnessed, endured, and approved not only by the crown in general, but also by the soldiers. Dio's not super happy about that. They acclaimed him Pythian victor, Olympian victor, victor in the grand tour, universal victor, beside all the usual expressions, and of course joined to these names the title belonging to his imperial office, so that that every one of them had Caesar and Augustus as a tag. So that's the end of my long reading out of passages, but I wanted to give you an idea of how these historians are characterizing these events in Nero's biography. And so clearly there's a problem here about an emperor acting on stage, taking part in these games. He's a chariot racer as well in some of these events too, and the public herald, of course, as well. But there's a very political edge to this in terms of the role of an emperor going away, performing in these games, and disgracing the line of the Caesars. Cassius Dio is the historian that says that with Nero, the line of Aeneas fell, right? This is the line that Julius Caesar traced back to Aeneas, and after this, there's a fundamental shift. And Nero is the last of these Caesars, and he's really earning his characterization as the last and the worst here. For Dio, and this sporting aspect of his biography is really key to that. It's where a lot of this sort of criticism comes out. Okay, but let's take a wider view. Let's step back from Nero a little bit, and here I realise I'm sort of probably I'm very much in the company of people who know this, the Athenian and Greek side of this much better than I, but perhaps they can correct me if I go wrong, Paul and Tom. But to start off with, just a little bit of a kind of idea about this relationship between politics and war, because of course it's not necessarily surprising that we have these ideas. So festivals generally were funded by members of the elite, such as through liturgies, and this is important even when war is a consideration. So the function of sport in society, as many brilliant people have written about, is sort of really fundamentally inscribed. And one example of this, there are many, but Isocrates writes about how Athens, our city, has not been backward, for she affords the most numerous and most admirable spectacles, some passing all bounds in outlay of money, some highly reputed for their artistic worth, and others excelling in both these regards. And the multitude of people who visit us is so great that whatever advantage there is in associating together, this also has been compassed by our city, Athens. So the function of sport within these sort of social, within the bigger political and social scene, marker of Greek identity, as Tom said, is a very sort of fundamental way of demonstrating these things, and a really important part of the sort of function of the year, as it were, or series of years. And the other thing that again, I'm drawing on David Pritchard's work in particular here, that this draws out, is that the victories of sportsmen in these festivals and the people who sponsor these games resonate with everyday people. So we're not just, even though it's elite participants and often elite athletes, we're not just talking about the elite in terms of how this resonates within society. The people, particularly in relation to athletics, really kind of take note of those who are winning for the cities that they belong to, those who are winning for their places, particularly in international competitions. And again, David Pritchard points to a number of references in political and legal speeches aimed at, for example, jurors, that make use of these sporting metaphors to try and persuade a selection of jurors of their particular argument, and that sort of resonates with the people who take part in these democratic spaces. This, though, can sort of changes slightly in characterization, but the elite idea continues as we move on into the Hellenistic period, and perhaps we get a little bit closer to the sort of Roman idea of how kings and kingship can intervene in these spaces. So as Tom has already mentioned, festivals and procession continue to be staged for demonstrating elite status, and Philip and Alexander are examples of this. Philip in those chariot races, but also Alexander as well. So sending in horses by aristocrats and kings, and Plutarch talks about this. And I quite like this quote, because it's sort of the things that you hear are all at the same time. 3 messages came to him. The first, that Parmenio had conquered the Illyrians in a great battle. The second was that his racehorse had won a victory at the Olympic Games. And the third announced the birth of Alexander. And in that order, maybe that wasn't quite what the messenger said, but that's how Plutarch reports it. And it's interesting because Alexander isn't particularly interested, it seems, according to Plutarch, in any case, in the athletics part of these competitions, but he does institute many contests, for, not only for tragic poets and players of the flute and the lyre, but also for rhapsodists and of hunting of every sort, and fighting with staves. So he's also instituting and sort of curating, if you like, these games as precedent. I mean, we could very much go down the road of Nero figuring himself as a Hellenistic king when he does these kinds of things, and I think there's absolutely room for that. But and that's very much Edward Champlin's argument as well, and this sort of evidence kind of points to it. But that's not what our sources think he's doing, or they're not happy with that. But as we move into Rome, it's not just emperors that act in this way, but also people who've been involved in the conquering of Greece, of provinces previously as well. So one example from the Third Macedonian War is the general Aemilius Paulus, who again took it, realized that it was such an important part of his role, if you like, as someone who was had brought Greece into, or partly brought Greece into the Roman Empire. It's a bit more complicated, but in part, that games were a part of this process. So after the serious business, Paulus celebrated with great pomp at Amphipolis, a festival which had long been under preparation, and to announce which he had sent men to the cities and kings of Asia, while he himself had given notice to the leading men during his tour of the Greek cities. From mouth to mouth went the saying of Paulus himself, that the man who knew how to conquer in war could also arrange a banquet and organize games. So again, that sort of military idea going along with this wider aspect of sports and games. Obviously, where Nero goes wrong is he doesn't do the military part. He just does the games part. However, when we come to emperors, it is a little bit more complicated than this, which is something that comes out in the scholarship. So emperors, roughly speaking, reframe this situation. So this is a quote from the book, that I put just at the top here by Sophie Romanson. So Roman emperors did not maintain the traditional aristocratic habit, she argues, of participating in the competition. The emperor was supreme in power and did not need to advertise his primacy. The emperors did continue the habit of presiding over Greek agones in order to promote themselves as committed leaders. Only rarely, however, did the emperors propose a new contest dedicated to a specific god, or did they provide funds from the imperial treasury. So the emperors, because, and this goes back to Cassius Dio saying Nero was treating people as equals, because they're on this higher plane, do have a bit of a different relationship. However, we should note that we do have inscriptions, for example, from inscriptions in Olympia of members of the imperial family, such as Tiberius and Germanicus, having Olympic victories, sending horses into these games and winning. I will note, though, that at the time of the inscription that names Tiberius, he's not emperor. It's before he becomes emperor. And Germanicus, of course, does not become emperor. But they are two very prominent members of the imperial family. So what I wanted to sort of end or put as a sort of thinking point, I suppose, as one of the ways that we might interpret some of this idea of what Nero is doing and where the problems are, beyond the very important points that Edward Champlin makes about the role of an emperor and that emperors shouldn't be on stage, and that this is a sort of idea of Nero expressing his affinity with Greece over Rome. We can also see this, I think, as part of a bigger picture that has actually to do with euergetism and benefaction. The idea that benefaction is expected of emperors is something that's sort of well documented in scholarship. It's something that we've been talking about for a while. This very recent book is one example of this, Benefactors and the Polis. It's an edited collection with excellent articles in there by Onno van Niff and Carlos Noreña on some of these issues. But the part of benefaction is that it's also a crucial part of the negotiation process of how the administration of empire functions between elites and the people. Emperors are part of the story of benefaction, but actually on a local level, it's much more to do with local elites. And the throwing of games is a huge part of that. As a local politician, as a local elite, being able to throw games and being able to have open competitions is hugely important to that story. So perhaps part of what Nero did wrong is not just that he abandoned Rome to participate in the games and treated his fellow competitors as equal, while also denigrating them and denigrating the position of emperor, but also because he's fundamentally undermining the ability in these games of local aristocrats to uphold their part of the deal that they make with their local communities. The idea that people should be able to send in and have a free and fair contest in a way that shows how benefaction functions. So this then is also about the running of empire and the facilitating shows of status in an imperial system that has to be careful about ideas of how status is shown in deference to the emperor, but also reinforcing local elites' capacity to continue to show their status in their local communities. And openness of the competition and the ability for elites to organise and to win is emphasised as part of this in inscriptions. So one example for you here, which comes from Van Niff's very brilliant, I think, chapter on athletics and paideia. So this is a statue put up to Popilius Sthenius Fronto, and it's essentially kind of foregrounding the games. He's a participant in the games that he's won, and this is a statue that commemorates that. So we have the agonothete recognised there, but then also Popilius Sthenius Fronto, and his parentage is put there, or patronymic. And then we have he was crowned in the men's pancration, open to all Lycians. And then at the bottom there, first my fatherland crowned me for the boys' wrestling and honoured me with a glorious statue in bronze. Later, having carried off from my fatherland the men's pancration in the festival open to all Lycians, I set up a lovely statue. So this inscription is one of many that we find in the Roman Empire, particularly in the Greek East, where it's incredibly important for these kinds of competitions to be open and accessible to all different kind of elites. So part of what Nero is doing, part of what the problem is, and I think particularly also for Cassius Dio, who comes from Asia Minor and is very aware of these kinds of issues, is that he is taking away from local elites these 4 major games where you can send in different representatives from different polis, from different parts, and have an open and a fair competition. And Nero fundamentally undermines that process. Not only is the problem that he is an emperor acting on stage and participating himself, but also he's undermining actually the very way that elites function in a very important part of the dynamics of their leadership in the Roman Empire and in the administrative system. So I'll end there, and that's why Nero matters. Nero's Olympic defeats matter.